Yeah, but I like.
Because I was thinking, why didn't you ever put the science class on?
What year was that?
Can you pass this back?
No, gonna be my freshman year.
Yeah.
Pass it back to Rachel. Rachel, you can be in charge of making sure folks in the back get a microphone. Hey, how's it going?
Good.
A little more Aristotle. Again, not easy stuff by a long shot. But I don't know what I find on this whole a little bit easier than physics and metaphysics. Yeah, it's going to get even better in Nicomachean ethics. Nicomachean ethics is going to start to be, oh yeah, I see where he's going. Remind me real quick, what did we have to say when we were talking about Aristotle's physics and metaphysics? Remember, there were 3 topics that we hit on last time. We talked about nature, the nature of nature. We talked about the relationship between matter and form, and we talked about the 4 causes. What's up with those 3 things? Somebody tell me about nature. What's nature all about? And I'll give you a hint. If we're ever talking about Aristotle, I'm like, what does Aristotle have to say about blank? You could do worse than to start out by saying, well, blank is said in many ways. Yeah.
Well, it said there's natural objects versus artifactual objects.
Artifactual, yeah. So that's our first distinction when we say like, oh, what are we talking about when we talk about nature? We're talking about a distinction, perhaps. One way of talking about nature is to talk about a distinction between natural objects and artifactual objects. What's the difference?
Natural objects, the source of principle of motion change comes from within.
That's right.
And artifactual objects, the principle of motion or change comes from without.
All right. So yeah. So again, just in case this didn't get picked up by my microphone or the microphone on the tablet, for natural objects, source of motion and change, the archaikineton. We'll be talking a little bit about that again today. The source of change or the source of motion comes from within the living or the natural thing itself, and for artifactual objects it comes from without. Does that make sense, just kind of intuitively? So like whatever it is that like makes something move, and we can be thinking about this, kind of like project just ahead a couple of steps to the efficient cause, or we could talk about some kind of more subtle ways of talking about what the principle of motion and change are, like the formal cause or even the final cause. All of this is within the thing, the natural thing itself. Whereas for a computer, what a computer is, what it takes for a computer to be a computer and do computerly stuff, depends very heavily on something outside of the computer. We can think about this in terms of its design. We can think about this in terms of its use and function. What computers are for, what they're good for, what makes a computer, relies almost necessarily, in fact, yes, let's go ahead and say necessarily, on some user. Computers are, what are computers? They're for something that we do with them. Same with clocks, same with tables, same with chairs. What's the essence of a chair? It's for being sat on, right? So yeah, we can see how like it's archaikineton, even though chairs don't move all that much, but like what it is that makes a chair into a chair comes from outside of the chair. That's artifactual objects. Natural objects, they seem to have their own archaikineton. Anything else about nature? There's like at least one other sense of the nature of nature. Let's spread it around a little bit. Yeah. That's right, yeah, nature as substance. So this is like the essence of something. I was kind of touching on it just a second ago here, and I was like, what is it that makes this chair its chair? What is the chair's nature, if that makes any sense, even though it's not a natural object, right? This is a second sense of nature where we're talking about its essence, its substance, it's what it is to be. The Greek word that Aristotle keeps throwing around here is ousia. We're going to get a slightly third sense of nature today, but we didn't cover that yet. What about the next thing, matter and form? What's up with matter and form for Aristotle? Ooh. Are you guys just shy? Yeah.
They depend like inextricably on each other. Like you can't have formless matter and you can't have matterless form.
Yeah, so this idea of them being pure, at least when it comes to ousia, right? When it comes to substances, when it comes to things, existing things. There is no formless matter, there is no matter without form. This is interesting because Aristotle is articulating a disagreement with a couple of folks that we've seen already. Anaximander talked about the apeiron, formless matter. Aristotle's like, nonsense. Separable in thought, perhaps, but not with respect to being. So form and matter are conceptually distinguishable. They're separable according to the logos, but only according to speech and thought. You'll never actually get them apart from one another. So we end up with this hylomorphic unity. For all things that are ousia, for all things with substance, you're going to have matter and form together, matter enjoined with form, formed matter, or in mattered form, however you want to look at it, right? Plato said forms as separable, as pure, and existing on their own. And again, Aristotle's like, no. Makes no sense. That makes no sense. We're going to see him kind of, depending on what our time looks like today, we might see him start to backtrack a little bit on this. This is some weird stuff that happens in Book 3, Chapter 5 of On the Soul. All right, so that's matter and form, not distinguishable according to being, but perhaps distinguishable according to thought. And furthermore, when it comes to understanding the nature of things, when it comes to understanding substance, when it comes to understanding the essence or the what it is to be of anything, Aristotle says this is the register of thought. We're talking kind of in a strange way, we're talking about thinking about things' natures or things' essences. And so he kind of sort of tips the hat just a little bit back to form. He says the two are inseparable with respect to being, even though they're conceptually distinguishable. But when it comes to talking about trying to understand things, when it comes to, by nature, all humans desire to know. That desire to know kind of inclines us a little bit towards the form of things, that we focus a little more on form than we do on things matter or material. All right, so that's the hule morphe, hylomorphic unity. What about the last thing? What about the four causes? I'll give you a hint, there's 4 of them. Let's start with Will for,
The material cause.
Material cause? All right, so that's the matter, right? And specifically, I don't know if I made this point, I hope I did, the material. There's a subtle difference. Like when I talk about matter, it's almost like it's too easy for me to talk about just prime matter, right? Unformed matter, just plain stuff. But when I say material, material is always matter for something, right? So I might say something like lumber is a good, like we can talk about wood and like what, like wood as like a kind of matter, a kind of stuff. But if we're talking about wood for something, for any kind of techne anta, for any kind of artifactual object, it's always, wood's almost the wrong word. Lumber, that's the word I want, right? It's material for building something. So that's the material cause. What else we got? Efficient cause. I heard formal. We'll get to that in just a second. Let's go with efficient cause. So what's the efficient cause?
It's the motive force that pushes something to move.
Yeah, so if we're talking about like building a table out of lumber, lumber is the material. The hammering of the nails, right? All of the motion, all of the labor of the craftsperson to make the table. This is the efficient cause. Anaxagoras kind of got a little bit of this, and a lot of the pluralists got at this. Empedocles and Anaxagoras got at this with an idea of something's got to move the matter. We have matter, sure, but something's got to move it. Whether for Empedocles it's love and strife, for Anaxagoras it's nous, but it's kind of a dumb form of nous. By dumb form of nous, I don't mean the idea itself is dumb. I mean like the nous doesn't seem to be thinking anything in particular. It just kind of moves stuff. All right, so that's our efficient cause. And I heard formal cause. Who said that? Formal cause? So what's the formal cause all about? Close. Let's come back to the table. The lumber is the material cause. The labor of the craftsperson, that's the efficient cause. What's the formal cause?
Like, what? Like, the shape of it, the form, like, its tableness.
Yeah, we can think of it, and this is something that we're going to get a real taste of, like, just how stretchy and slippery a term like form, the term morphe for Aristotle is going to be. He's going to play a little bit fast and loose with it when he talks about the soul. but we can think of it as the shape of the table, right? The outward form. We can also think of it as the essence, although like we want to be careful with that because essence, the what it is to be of something, that's its substance, that's ousia, and we know that we need both matter and form, right? We don't want to make an outright identity between form and essence, but Aristotle is going to kind of like feint that way an awful lot. He's going to say this is the way of understanding the essence of something, is to think about its form. So I can think in terms of the table's outward shape, and Aristotle loosens this up a little bit more than that. He'll use the term eidos when he wants to talk about the shape or the look of something. Morphe, which is what he uses far more often when you see it translated as form, is a kind of a slightly more abstract idea. So we've got the outward shape of the table. We might also have its function as well, like what it does, as a really big part of the form of a table. And last but not least, the final cause. And Gretchen, this is what you were saying. It's this kind of almost, how would we say it? What is the final cause? The goal, the telos, the what is it good for, right? This is a way of talking about cause that might be a little bit unfamiliar, although we'll notice that like sometimes this is what somebody means when they ask a why question. These are all that Aristotle's 4 causes are. There are 4 different ways of answering a why question, 4 different ways of asking a why question as well, focusing on different aspects of trying to understand why the world is the way that it is, or some particular pocket of the world, like the table, is the way that it is. And one of the ways of answering it is like, why is the table the way that it is? Because of what it's good for, because of its goal. This is a cause that's not temporally behind the event, kind of propelling it forward. This is a cause that's in the future of the event. It's kind of dragging it along with it, saying like, come to me. I'm the target that you're aiming for. Plenty of examples for this, right? Why did the student give the professor a bunch of money? Because they wanted to get a good grade, right? This would be a final cause. It's a for the sake of which. Don't try to bribe your professors. Okay. Today we're going to be talking about the soul. We're going to be talking about the way that we see it in Book 2 of Aristotle's De Anima, or On the Soul. If we have time, we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in Book 3, this just kooky, crazy stuff, and then we'll get into the first book of Nicomachean Ethics. So we've got Aristotle on the soul. Remind me what Plato had to say about the soul? That it was one of the forms, or it was an awful lot like the forms? It's immortal, yeah. It exists apart from the body, right? It's separable from the body. When the body dies, the soul lives on. So we've got this idea of soul identified with form for Plato, but form as something that's separable from matter. In fact, like not just with respect to thought, but with respect to being as well. And this is why we get the whole idea of an immortal soul, right? What about for Aristotle? What's the soul? What is, maybe we could start with what isn't the soul? Yes, Andrew.
Sort of the, I want to say substance, not substance.
It's not the
Form.
yeah, the form, right? But the way in this, the way, yeah, we'll see that it gets blurry, but yeah.
Makes something animate. So it's like, I guess the example in Coco is that one of the brass horse thing, like even though it's shaped like a horse, it's not a living animal because it doesn't have the form.
Because it doesn't have the form of the living thing, right? It has the outward look of a horse. You can make a statue of a horse. It's got the shape, but it doesn't have the form of the horse in the sense of the form of a lived body, right? So this is, we're going to get a couple of these definitions. Here's a nice one to start with. The soul is the form of the living body. Form here is morphe. So not just the outward look, not the idea of Plato. It's not just an idea. It's not a concept. We'll see it's a far looser and kind of squishier sort of concept. And one of the reasons why this ends up being squishy and a little bit vague around the edges is something that we saw at our last meeting, which is that these four causes for Aristotle, the material, the efficient, the formal, and the final cause, especially when we're talking about living things, but we can do this for artifacts as well, they tend to kind of collapse into one another a little bit. The easiest sorts of things to conceptually distinguish are between like material and formal aspects of something's being. But when we're talking about like the efficient, the formal, and the final cause, we see these things start to kind of get blurry and mushed together. And that's actually intentional. It's not a flaw of what Aristotle's doing. At least he takes it to not be a flaw. What he's trying to say is that these are different perspectives on the same thing. To understand them all together is actually to be progressing. It's to be seeing things as they are. These four causes are just modes of thought or modes of question asking and answering. They're not descriptions of reality itself. They're ways of separating things in thought, not necessarily with respect to being. So the soul is the form of the living body, and we'll get a really quick what it's not. The soul is not an independent substance. When we say it's not an independent substance, we're saying it's not an existing thing. There are no soul. He's got a whole book about the soul that he opens up in book 2, talking about how the soul isn't really a thing. Or an independently existing thing. Why not? Why would somebody write a whole book about the soul if they're going to say it's not actually an independently existing thing? The soul is not an ousia. Why isn't the soul an independently existing thing? We just said it's the form of the living body. Yes?
That because it's a form of the living body, it has to be part of the body. And when
Like my thumb is a part of my body?
yeah, I would, or maybe I know the way it describes it is when something dies, then the soul is gone.
That's true, right? Yeah. So it's, especially since it's the form of the living body. Andrew gave us an example of something that's got the shape of a horse, but it's not ensouled. It's not actually alive. We could talk about a horse corpse as well, in which case we'd say no soul there. Do we have a horse body there? Kinda. We'll get into this in just a second. Yeah, Andrew.
I think Omar's answer is more Cartesian, sort of, if I misunderstood it.
That the soul is a part of the living organism, just like a body part is the part of a living organism?
Was that the pituitary gland or whatever that Descartes talked
The pineal gland.
Pineal gland.
Yeah.
Stuff like that, but it's not like that.
Well, the pineal gland isn't the soul. It's where for Descartes, it's where the soul and it's like the meeting place between the soul and the body, right?
Yes, but so would it be fair to say that the soul is contingent on the body? And vice versa?
It might be, yeah, or at least because we know that if it's the form of the living body, let's think about this. Is form ousia? Is form a substance? All on its own. I'll give you a hint. We just talked about it. It was one of the 3 things that we talked about at our last meeting that I just recapped, that you guys just recapped. Can I get an independently existing thing if all I've got is form? Nope. What else do I need?
Stuff.
I need matter, right? I need some stuff. And is the stuff independently existing? As a thing? No, not really. It needs form. So let's come back just a second to a horse corpse. Is a horse corpse a horse body?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't have the soul? Are horses living things? Is the horse body a living thing? The corpse, at least. Is that a living thing? This is it's material for a horse, right? But if it's not going to do horsely things, Aristotle will say it's a body. Dead bodies are bodies in name only, perhaps. They're not really, if we're going to kind of take this Thrasymachus and Socrates approach, a dead body is not a body in the precise sense. It's just in a manner of speaking would we say that a dead body is a body. Bodies are like parts of living organisms, right? So if something is dead, now it's a pile of flesh and bones, perhaps. Maybe that's what it is. It's just stuff. And we're like, stuff for what? If it's a dead horse, it's not stuff for getting up and like eating oats and jumping over fences or anything like that. It's stuff now for mushrooms to eat, maybe, right? Yeah.
Turning into
Is it saying that our bodies aren't really us? We are our souls and our bodies are more so just a pile of flesh that we're just inhabiting?
Well, if we are existing things, if I'm an ousia, which I'm pretty sure I am, I'm pretty sure I'm a thing. I'm a little less sure, but pretty sure that you're a thing too. Like a genuinely existing thing. That means that I'm not just my soul. My soul is like part of a unity that is like material and form, right? The material part is my body. The formal part is my soul. It's the form of the lived body, such that it's living. And we can talk about dead bodies, or we can talk about like body parts too. I can chop off a hand and be like, is that a hand? And then we'll say like, it's a hand in name only, I suppose. But if it's not doing the things that a hand does, it's maybe even got the shape and the outward look of a hand. But if it's not engaged in the activity that hands are engaged in, if it doesn't perhaps enjoy the relationship to the end of my arm that hands typically do, then we'll say like, yeah, it's not a hand in the proper sense anymore. It's really just flesh and bone now on the table. If I could reattach it, then maybe we'll say it's a potential hand. Which gets us into thoughts of actuality and potentiality. Because Aristotle quickly pivots from this talk of the soul as the form of the living body, whereas the body is the material. If an individual person is an ousia, then the body is the hule, and the soul is the morphe, right? It's the hylomorphic unity that makes something a substance, that makes something an ousia. So the soul is the form, the body is the material, and a living organism is this union of body and soul. You lose one of those things when all you've got left is the material and no more form of the living body. The organism's gone, right? The individual thing is gone. This is different than Socrates and Plato were talking about. Socrates and Plato are talking about the soul lives on after the body dies. Not so here. When a living organism dies for Aristotle, that's it. No more thing. Which I guess is there's a little bit of anxiety that comes along with that if you realize that you're going to die someday. It's not just that, like, I'll move on to some unfamiliar place. It's not even like this kind of, ooh, could be nice. I'll free my soul from the prison of my body. It's like, no. These two things are not separable according to being. You will cease to exist when you die, according to Aristotle. I don't know if that's better or worse. It's certainly weirder. Because non-existence is a weird thing, right? Yes?
He says that the soul is a source of like sense perception and making things true and stuff like that. But isn't that like what your brain does? Like, but that's part of your body. That's not something that's
Brain is part of your body, yeah.
That's like the actual body.
Yeah, so there's the brain is just kind of like my body is not, I can do all kinds of bodily activities too, right? I can do a little dance, and we'll say like, oh, was that just my body? And we're like, it's my body informed in a certain way and performing certain activities, what made it move. You can say the same thing about my brain, right? My brain perceives, it does all kinds of stuff, but it doesn't just do it automatically. Something makes it move somehow, right? So, well, like Aristotle was not just like ignorant of the fact that brains were things. The Greeks bashed open enough heads to know that like there were brains inside. They hadn't really done any kind of vivisection and like experimented on people to find out what it is that the brains are actually doing. But they knew that you needed them. They knew that if they got damaged, like that was the end of you. Like you couldn't live anymore. But still we have this question of like, yeah, but the brain acting, the brain performing seems like it's at least conceptually a slightly different thing, right? So to just reduce it to the hule of the brain is still not going to quite be enough. It's only half the equation. We need informed matter, not just matter. And maybe this is exactly what we mean. When we say a brain, I don't mean a thing in a jar on my desk, because that's not a brain. It's a brain in name only. Brains do brainly things. They think. They've got to be attached to like the rest of the body. They've got to be oxygenated by blood. They've got to be thinking. We'll get to this in a second about how weird we might try to consider about, like, well, what about when the brain's not thinking? Like right now for many of you. Or when you're asleep and not dreaming. Like, so what's going on with the brain there? Where's its activity? All right, so we need to transition to this, which means we need to do like one little slight pivot from matter and form to talking about this kind of parallel conversation that Aristotle really articulates very well in Metaphysics books Zeta and Eta, if you're looking for some extra Aristotle reading, which I know many of you are. Are you? If you're looking for some extra Aristotle reading, Metaphysics books Zeta and Eta get into this sort of thing that he just kind of gestures towards, but I think we're going to be able to see where he's going from. We have this idea of, let's start with body. Body as potentiality, and soul as actuality. Greek words here are going to be dunamis is the word that he's using for potentiality, and for actuality. We actually get a couple of different words that kind of play around the idea of actuality, but the one he's using here is energeia. If you know a little bit of Greek, well, it's in the ergon. It's the at work. That's another way of thinking about the actuality. It's the at work of something. In the ergon. Ergon is work. So the body has potentiality, the soul has actuality. Where we can think about, this is true of, like, we can think of matter and form this way too. Matter is always potentially something, especially if you think about something like a pot, something I'm going to make out of clay, or a hunk of brass that I'm going to make into like a statue. It's always potential. We can think about these stories, like Michelangelo sees the block of marble and he sees like the potential in it. These are all the places where I could carve away. It's almost like the potentiality of the block of marble is already speaking to the sculptor as soon as they see it. They're like, this is what I can do with this. Present certain possibilities. There's the potentiality that body represents. And then there's this actuality, the at work. And in Aristotle says, this is the soul. The soul is the actuality of the living body. So we get it's the form of the living body, and it's the actuality of an organism, or the at-workness of an organism. Maybe another way we can think about this is as the activity. And I had already kind of gestured towards this a little bit, that like when we're talking about the form, the soul as the form of the living body, I don't just mean its shape. I also mean perhaps its activity. So we get another pair of concepts to think along with matter and form here, and these are the concepts of potentiality and actuality, or activity, or being at work. That's how Joe Sachs. There's other translators who will translate these terms different ways. Joe Sachs manages every technical term for Aristotle. Joe Sachs turns into a big, long, hyphenated thing, just so it sticks out like a sore thumb when you're reading. You're like, that's a technical word. So that energeia is the being at work of the organism, and this is the soul. It's the activity of the living body. Is he contradicting himself, or are we just seeing a different side of the same idea? What's the difference between a living thing and a dead thing? Does the dead thing do anything?
It rots.
Yeah, it rots, but that's a very passive, rotting happens to it, right? Living things do stuff. They have activity. That's the soul. But we've got this problem that, things are not always active. This chair, for example. What's the activity of the chair if it has a sort of an activity that is its essence?
It's supporting.
What's that?
To hold things up.
Yeah, but it's not doing it right now. Is it just not a chair? It's only a chair when I'm actually sitting on it? We could say the same thing about an organism. What is it that a human does? When you're asleep and you're not doing any of those things, Your soul just blink out of existence? This would be weird. Locke actually talks about this. He's like, maybe. Yeah, when you're asleep and not dreaming, your soul is just, there is no soul. Which might sound kind of weird, but if you think about it from your perspective as a subject, that's exactly what happens. The world just turns off when you go to sleep. And then when you wake up, it's like, whoop, like right back where you started. Sometimes you don't even know, like you'll wake up and be like, how much time was that? 9 hours? No kidding? All right. Remember that when you used to sleep for 9 hours? It was like back in the summer. Ironically, that's the time you want to be out and about the most, and you end up sleeping the most. Body is potentiality, soul is actuality, but we've got this question of like, yeah, but souls aren't constantly active. They're not always doing the things that they're doing. So what's up with that? And the way that Aristotle gets around this is he makes a distinction between what he calls first and second energeia, or first and second actuality. And we can think about it like this, and in other places, Aristotle does this in terms of like first and second potentiality, so that it might be that first energeia is actually second dunamis, or it might be that we have like 4 things. This is like a great grad seminar type question for like us to wrestle about, but we're not going to sweat it right now. We're just worried about like this difference between first energeia and second energeia that has to do with this question of like, yeah, but the soul is not always constantly in action. So what is it like only sometimes there and sometimes it like goes away? What's going on? Well, we can think about it like this. Can I? Well, you guys don't know about me. Let's make it about you. Kylie, can you play the violin? Cannot play the violin? So you like are not a violin player? Even potentially? Well, maybe potentially though, right? No, not even potentially? You've got fingers, don't you? You have all the requisite body parts. I believe you probably, unless you are like completely tone deaf and like you're one of these people that like pitch and like organization of pitches into melody just makes no sense at all to you. But I bet, do you listen to music and you enjoy it? You can play the violin. But not right now, right? If we just handed her a violin, she wouldn't be able to do it. She has a certain kind of potentiality for playing the violin that hasn't been actualized yet. This is probably true. Is there anybody here who can play the violin? 1, 2, all right. Everybody else is merely a potential violinist. And even those of us who like don't have any hands, we might say like this is a technological problem for us now. We will find a way to get you to like be able to play the violin.
Yeah, the technology.
If you were brain dead, maybe then we would be like, all right, not even a potential violinist.
No, just hook some robots up to the body. And
Then you're not a violinist, you're a violin playing machine. You're part of a violin playing machine. Maybe we'll insist that a violinist has to be a person. Maybe not. Now we're just splitting hairs, right? Okay. So all of us have a certain potential to play the violin insofar as we could be trained. Once somebody is trained, so let's talk about Nick and Andrew over here who raise their hand and say like they can play the violin. They're more of an actualized potentiality than we are, right? But they're not currently playing the violin, are they? So you're not actually a violinist. The only actually violinist is somebody who's playing the violin right now, who's engaged in the activity. But see how we need to make this distinction between that which is kind of like just a really raw potential that needs to be trained or organized in a certain way in order to be accessed. We have another one that's like ready to go as soon as it's time. And we have this other second energeia, which is at work right now. We might even note that even to be like a good violinist, you can't be in second energeia all the time. And that's not just because you need to break for lunch. It's because any violinist that is constantly playing is a terrible violinist. The song's got to end sometime. And a violinist that doesn't know when to stop is like not an actually good musician. And there are like places in a song where the violinist needs to like hang back, not like constantly be playing notes for the entire song. Maybe there are songs where the violinist plays the whole time. Flight of the Bumblebee or something. But any actuality involves a kind of like a popping back and forth. Any energeia involves a kind of like a withholding and a kind of springing forth, like a readiness to action and then an actual activity of action. That's kind of like a popping back and forth between first and second energeia. Yes?
I also say, using the music example, good thing by Mozart, quote he has, it's like the music isn't just the notes, but the silence.
The silence between the notes, right? Yeah.
Just like a constant tone.
Yeah, we saw the same sort of thing when we were talking about the archway, too. The archway isn't just the matter, it's the space inside the matter, right? We can talk about this, any kind of architecture. It's not just the materials, it's the space that the material frames as well. And we can say, yeah, exactly the same thing about music. Do we get what's going on here? And like why this is like a compelling sort of a shift in structure for thinking about this. We're thinking about body as matter or material. It's the stuff that an organism is made out of. And then there's the form, which also includes the activity or the actuality of the organism. It's, you know, like whatever's missing from the corpse that makes something an existing living organism or an existing thing. And now we need to make this split between like recognizing that like, well, there's a sort of a active potential or a potential activity that we'll call first energeia, and then there's an actual activity, an active activity that we'll call second energeia. And the soul is both of these. It certainly concerns both of these. And we'll see that, especially when we start to talk about virtue, it's focused on first energeia. Questions so far? Saw some squinty eyes and like motions like people were going to raise hands. Yes?
So first energeia would be if someone's sleeping, and the second one is if they're kind of awake and thinking.
Yeah, so yeah, we could say that. Ooh, yeah, so like is a sleeping human an actual human? Yeah, a sleeping human is an actual human. As a matter of fact, especially when we recognize that it is proper for all humans to sleep for at least part of the day. Any human that never slept is not human. Not alive anymore, yeah, or won't be for long, right? If they can manage to stay quote unquote alive, then we'll say like this is a different form of life than the human. This thing that needs not sleep. So yeah, we could say that. And if we're thinking about like, yes, but what are the activities that make humans human? Is sleep an activity? I guess in a way of speaking. Is inactivity an activity? It's a withholding of activity, right? Yeah, so we can think about sleep as first energeia. We might also think about, if you really wanted to think about sleep as an activity, which some of us, sleep enthusiasts, I think some of us do think about it. Like, I've seen it before on questionnaires. Like, what is your favorite thing to do? People. Good so far? Yes. This one is being at rest? Yeah, being at rest but ready to act for action. Yeah, and this would be like being unstructured somehow, or like disorganized perhaps. That whatever we've got going on here, body as potentiality, it's more than just being at rest. The same way that like when you see like a corpse, you're like, you're not thinking to yourself like, it's sleeping. Maybe you are thinking that, but like, are we all aware that like that's a figure of speech only, that a dead body is not in fact sleeping? It's not a body at rest. It's not even really a body at all. It's just a pile of stuff now. Yeah.
So if you shoot a zombie in the head, is that technically zombie sleep?
Is a zombie alive? Is a zombie a living thing? Where's its archaekineton? Is it within? Does it move itself? What made the zombie move? Moved itself.
Undead.
Undead, yeah. Let's first preface by saying zombies are not real things. So this is a strange conversation already. But if they were...
What kind of zombies?
Like Romero zombies, I guess? Like movie zombies, not philosophical zombies.
Well, but there are like different types of zombies in movies and media.
That's true. Walking Dead zombies, will that do?
I mean, I'm not familiar with The Walking Dead, so I guess most,
Well, you-
most
Mr.
people
like-
might be, so I just
Let's make
can't-
distinctions between zombies. Doesn't even know the biggest zombie thing going on right now. So what kind of zombies do you, like what sorts of differences do you have in mind between different kinds of zombies?
Well, there are multiple things that like are called or considered zombies, such as in The Last of Us, they're people who have been taken over and essentially killed by a fungus that keeps their bodies moving.
Yeah,
and, like,
so in
uses
which
them as
case,
predatory appendages.
if that's true, then the fungus is the organism, right? The fungus is the living thing, and the corpse of the zombie, the body of the zombie, right, is really just like what? It's like a sock puppet for the fungus.
Yeah.
In which case we would say like, yeah, maybe, no, not really. I guess then the zombie is not, and if, depends on what you mean. Is the zombie the fungus?
The symbiosis is the zombie.
Ah,
'Cause
the unity
without
of the fungus and the corpse is the
Because
zombie?
without the corpse, the fungus can't.
That's right, because if the fungus is
propagate.
just grown on a tree stump, we don't say, it's a zombie. We say it's the fungus that causes zombism.
Sure.
But when it matches, yeah, okay, I would say, yeah, it's a living thing. It's not human, though, right?
Fungus is growing on a tree, it would be a zombie tree.
No.
Does that fungus hijack the tree? There are fungi who do this with ants. I know there's a fungus that attacks ants and it gets in their little ant brains and starts growing, and it makes them do things that they wouldn't ordinarily do, including like climb up to the highest point that they can find, and then they die, and then the fungus blooms and like spreads its spores as far as it can. That's like one of the creepiest things I've ever heard. This like fungus that hijacks your. Then there are other things like what's it called? What's that thing that affects cats? That pregnant women can't be around. What's it called? Toxoplasmosis.
Something or other.
Toxoplasmosis, which affects mice and rats and makes them extra special bold and not afraid of cats anymore. Rats ordinarily wouldn't want to get near a cat, mostly because the cat could kill it and frequently does. But the toxoplasmosis gets into the cat's brain and gets into the mouse's brain or the rat's brain and says like, nah, go for it, and then the cat eats the rat, and now the disease is spreading itself. Crazy. Diseases are weird like that. They hijack bodies and get them to... It even does it to yourself, and you're like, I have this disease, I have this infection in my body, and here I am just kind of like making all kinds of snot and sneezing it and coughing it all over the place. That's what the disease wants you to do. That's going to spread it to new bodies. Yep.
I had a relevant question and one about the so pregnant women can't be around it because
Oh, they can. They just might get sick, and it can affect the development of the fetus.
okay, but they don't like the brain thing that happened on that scale.
No, they don't. Yeah, they don't develop a sudden lack of fear of cats. Yeah, that's right.
That's what happens to those crazy cat ladies.
The potentiality thing.
Yes, please. Yeah, let's get back to that.
Like, where's the potential for what in case of a dead body?
The potential for all of the activities that an organism performs.
If the soul.
If the soul was there, yeah. And in fact, keeping in mind that like you need both like hule and morphe, you need the hylomorphic unity in order for a thing to exist. Whenever we have a body in the proper sense, we do have form. Body is always informed material. And whenever we have the form of a living body, it's always the form of a living body, right? It's always informed matter. So the two, in the proper sense, are always going to be coming along with one another. They're only distinguishable according to thought. All right. Actuality, first and second actuality. And we'll get another way of thinking about this. We'll think about this as soul as organizing principle. For the body. And we've seen this phrase organizing principle before in a couple of places. It's the arche, right? And it's not just any old body, it's the living body. The organizing principle for the living body is the arche of this living body. That's the soul. It's what keeps the living body in the proper shape, performing the right sorts of acts. This is, by the way, when I say a living body, and sometimes I'll use the word organism to talk about it. The reason why we call it an organism is because it's an organizational structure, a relationship between body parts, right? All organisms have parts, and they're organized in a certain way. And that organizing principle that keeps them organized in the right way so that that body can be alive and an actual body. Not just a body in like a manner of speaking. Not just a corpse, which is stuff for necrotrophs to munch on. That's the soul. That's an ensouled body. And the soul is what does all this organizing, is the organizing principle of the living thing. And when we talk about like what is it that a body needs to be organized for in order to live, well, it moves, right? It moves and it changes. So we have it's the arche for the living body. It's an arche kineton. It's an organizing principle for movement and change in a living thing. Yes?
In Plato, when Simius was talking about how the soul is the body and harmony is to the harp.
As the harmony is to the harp?
Like, isn't it kind of like this?
This is this, yeah. Yeah, if you're recognizing this a little bit from Phaedo and saying, like, this is like the harp harmony thing, you're like, totally. It is totally like the harp harmony thing, especially when we recognize that there was this ambiguity when we were talking about the harmony. Like, well, I know what the harp is. It's the matter. What is the harmony? And at one point we were playing around with the idea that it's the music that gets played by the harp. It's the activity of the harp. When you strum it, it makes music. And Aristotle is kind of saying like, yeah, kind of like that. But also we played with this idea that maybe it's the attunement of the harp. It's the way that you kind of get the harp into shape so that when you strum it, it makes music. And Aristotle is saying like, yeah, that too. Because notice this, like this is what a living thing does. A lot of its activity is keeping itself in the right shape, keeping itself organized. When the soul stops doing that organizational work, what happens to the body? It decomposes, it comes apart. Tell me about, since we're talking about the organizing principle of a living body, let's start with like a couple of examples that we can maybe start to get some idea of like what this is all about. Let's start with a knife. I know a knife is not alive, but let's pretend like a knife was alive and like it had a soul. What's the activity? If the knife was alive and it had some certain activity that was like proper to like the sorts of things that knives do, what is it's cutting, right? This is what knives do. They cut things. And if the knife had a soul, it would be able to like maintain itself. It would organize itself into like all of these things for cutting. Knives don't really quite have that. This is why we say knives don't have souls. Aristotle talks about the eye as an example, though. Is that what you were going to bring up?
No, actually, I just think a knife needs to be sharpened. That's why it's not.
A knife does need to be sharpened, yeah, and it gets sharpened from without, right? Where does the organizing principle for a knife come from? Comes from the knife master, right? Comes from the person who makes the knife, not from the knife itself. This is why a knife is not alive. And it doesn't maintain itself. A craftsperson or a cook sharpens the knife. If the knife did sharpen itself, and there are some self-sharpening knives out there, they're better candidates for being alive, I suppose. But still, nah, not really. What about oh, yes, Gretchen.
What about someone who's handicapped but can't take care of themselves? Like they need someone to take care of them.
But they still do like move and do stuff by themselves, right? They have a certain amount of autonomy.
Some of them don't.
If you were so handicapped that you couldn't do anything for yourself, including like move your blood around your body, then we might say, yeah, you're not alive anymore. You're like an assemblage of machines. Although this starts to get into some like murky territory as well, right? Yeah, that's a tough call. And it also gets into, like, you've raised an interesting question that's going to fall just slightly outside of this course. But you're right. Aristotle seems, and like a lot of people after him, like well through the Enlightenment, we're going to get this idea of like a person is independent. A person kind of does things for themselves. And this question about like, for example, what about handicapped people? What about small children who don't really take care of themselves completely, right? other people feed them and clothe them and help take care of them, we might recognize that there are some exceptional cases that for a long time philosophers were like, yeah, we'll have to figure out a way to get them in. And more recently, I'd say since the 1970s, particularly some feminist philosophers have been saying, like, you guys have it all wrong. Nobody's completely independent. Everybody needs a little bit of help. We're all interdependent on one another. Okay. Soul as the organizing, all right, the eye. An eye is not exactly a living thing, but it's close. What is the, if the eye had a soul, what would the soul of an eye be?
Seeing?
It would be seeing, yeah. This is a great little metaphor that Aristotle brings out for us. If the eye had a soul, it would be sight. Which now raises this question of like, yeah, maybe an eye doesn't have a soul. And whatever the organizing principle of an eye is like whatever keeps it capable of seeing things. So like, for example, like wiping away grit from the outside, right? The ability to kind of like blink and clean itself. The ability to kind of like maintain some cellular integrity, to repair damage when the damage happens. These are all the things that the eye does, all of the activities of the eye that are all pointed towards one thing, which is like, this is the essential activity of the eye. It's the essence. This is yet another way of thinking about the soul. Soul as the essence of the organism. And again, we want to be careful here because like we don't want to say that it's an independently existing thing. We've almost come full circle between this and this where we might recognize that like those two are not actually going to get along with one another. So we have to be careful when we say that the soul is the essence of the living thing. It's not any kind of substance exactly, but it's maybe the way that we understand the substance of a living thing. It's the kind of the what it is to be of something. We have to keep in mind that it's always acting on matter. There's got to be some material there. Kind of triangulating the idea of a soul here, where if you could think by some sort of analogy here, if the eye had a soul, the eye's soul would be sight. Humans have souls.
Do they?
Are humans, and all that Aristotle means here is that, like, you're alive, right? Anything that's alive has a soul. That's all that soul is. It's the form of the living body. Do humans have living bodies? Then we've got souls. What sort of activity are we talking about? If we're thinking about form as just shape, I've got some idea of what the rough shape of the average human looks like, but form is more than that. It's also the actuality, the at work, the activity of the human body. That's also what the soul is. So what's the activity of humans? What's the essential activity? What's the organizing principle that makes a human a human? For an eye, it's sight. For a knife, it's cutting things. For a human, it's...
Humanity?
We'll put that one on the shelf for just a little while. We'll get back to that question. But it's a tough one. As a matter of fact, you start to go into any kind of like fully blown organism. Let's start with a plant, for example. Because plants are alive. Plants have living bodies. Do they have souls? Yeah, they have living bodies. They have souls. And they have a particular kind of soul. This gets into, I think we're still in book 2 of On the Soul. Aristotle starts doing a little taxonomy. He starts like mapping out types of souls for us. And he looks through plants, animals, and humans. You guys remember this from the reading? Tell me about the plant soul. What does the plant soul do? What's the activity of a plant? It's nutritive, right? This is what plants can do. Plant souls are nutritive. Which is to say, they take in nutrition. They kind of passively take in nutrition. And they grow. And they kind of like maintain their bodies through some sort of kind of like cellular metabolism. We might even say that they behave in certain ways. Have we been here before? The roots grow down, The stem grows up towards the sun. A sunflower, or like lots of plants, will turn their leaves towards a light source. So they kind of sort of behave, but it's all geared towards just this through nutrition. And when we think about the ways in which like a plant will kind of move itself, for example, to get a little more sunlight, this is always predicated on growth. And this question of like which way is it going to grow? Which way is it going to build its body? It's got an organizing principle in it that builds its own body and maintains its own body such that it's able to perform the sorts of activities that are required for it to be alive. And not just to be alive in any old way, to be alive in the particular way that a plant is, particular way that the particular species of plant is alive. One thing that plants can't do, this is actually not entirely true. There's at least one kind of tree in the world that can do it. And if Aristotle would have found it, he would have shit himself. But plants never really kind of like look around and say like, the soil here is no good. And there's like not enough water, but like over there, the soil is awesome and there totally is water. So what I'm just gonna kind of like pick up my stuff and like move from one place to another. There is one kind of tree that can do this, which is freaky, in which case that tree is not a plant anymore. That tree is that's an animal. If it can get up and move around, that's an animal. Now, here's the thing about animal souls. They do all the stuff that plant souls do. Animal souls are nutritive as well. Animals eat. They engage in basic cellular processes. They grow. They maintain their own tissues when there's damage, the same way that a plant does. Animal souls have a nutritive component of their soul, but in addition to that, they have this part of the soul that allows them to move around. Now, this is the sort of activity that an animal can engage in that a plant can't. And yes, in a sense, the soul is this activity, but it's also the organizing principle that allows for that activity. What is the organizing principle that allows something to move around? Because we've got to recognize that when animals get up and move around from place to place on the surface of the earth, they're not just like spazzing out, like doing it all willy-nilly, just like there's an order to it, right? There's a seeming purposiveness. So we need some kind of organizing principle that makes animals move in certain ways. Move in certain ways that are going to be conducive to like an organizing principle that keeps them alive and keeps them active in all of the ways that are proper to a living body, in their particular form of living body, that particular form of life. What is it that makes animals move around on the surface of the earth?
Motive force.
Desire. Yeah, it's not like a mysterious motive force. It's internal, right? The internal thing that makes animals move around that plants apparently don't have, because if they did have it, they would move, is desire. There's another side to desire. There's also fear. Desire is it's this state of an animal soul that gets it to move towards something. Fear is the state of the animal soul that gets it to like move away from something, right? So between these two things, it's kind of Empedoclean, right? A love and strife sort of thing. There's desire, and then there's fear. And we also have to recognize these things. So there's actually, in fact, there's perception, sensory perception. And along with that sensory perception, an evaluation of whether something is desirable or fearful. And between these things, we have perception with the evaluation of desire and fear, and we have the nutritive soul. Now we've got animals. And this explains why it is that animal souls are able to do the sorts of things that animals do. Then we've got the human soul. Do human souls have a nutritive component? They do. You can eat, digest, and do all the sorts of stuff with food and metabolize food, and you can build your own body and like maintain the tissues. Nutritive soul is totally at work in the human body. What about perception and desiring and fearing? Humans got it? Anything else, or are we mere animals? Is there anything that makes the human soul different than the animal soul?
Reason?
The desire.
Reason.
Yes, the
Yeah.
desire.
I see.
Not just the desire for reason, the faculty of reason, yeah.
The fact that we have a irrational part of the soul and like a rational part of the soul.
Yeah, we'll get to that in just a second when we get into Nick ethics. Yeah, now the soul is going to have parts. In fact, we already get some sense here that the soul kind of has parts, right? There's a nutritive part, and a perceiving and evaluating part, and now a rational part of the soul as well. And basically what's going on here is that we'll recognize that like animals can see something and desire it. Say a dog sees a squirrel and is like, I desire that squirrel. And it will go after that squirrel. A human can see a squirrel and desire it. A human can see a pizza and desire it and say to itself, yes, but I also desire bodily health, and the pizza is not conducive to that, so I'm going to not give in to that desire. I'm going to make a rational decision where I say, like, I desire this, and now I'm thinking through this process of, like, how am I going to get to the things that I really desire, and, like, I start engaging in reason. I'm not just a slave to desire and fear the way an animal is, the way a mere animal is. I also have reason. Let's go with Gretchen first.
I kind of have an example, also kind of asking if this is an actual example, but one of my dogs, he went outside and she was inside, and there was a bag of dog food unopened on the ground, and she ate the whole thing.
The whole thing.
I had to take her to the hospital and like to the vet place and get her stomach pumped, because she just ate until she like couldn't even.
What kind of dog? Lab?
No.
Golden?
She's a Welsh Springer family.
Oh, wow.
But, like,
Yeah.
would that be an example of like she didn't have to?
She had desire. Yeah. Some animals actually have like a shut-off switch where they're just kind of like, I'm full, I no longer desire food. Some animals, including some dogs, labs and goldens are really, really bad about it. That like if you leave food out for them, they will eat themselves into like a food coma for sure, yeah. And very, very unhealthily. Some humans, myself included, like there are some times where I'm just kind of like, I'm full, but it's delicious. So what am I going to do? Stop? Perhaps if my reason were engaged a little more actively, in the sense of second energeia, not just first energeia. Yeah.
But like, if you have a shock collar on a dog, and it knows that if it goes out of it, even if it sees a squirrel there, that it's going to be shocked. And that can be reason.
Yeah, so here's the question. Do we think that animals are actually engaging in reason when they do this? The sort of classical conditioning that's used, or the kind of behaviorist tactics that are used? We're building this sort of behavior through fear and desire, and there's never any reason itself. If there was reason, we might imagine that like you could just talk to your dog and explain like you shouldn't cross this line because then you might die. And maybe there's just a language barrier there. Maybe it's just that the dog doesn't understand what dying is, which doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have reason, because that's actually a really difficult concept. But yeah, I think most expectations are that like, nah, training a dog is like, it's still playing on fear and desire. We haven't really quite gotten to reason just yet. And it's also not entirely clear that humans we sit around and talk about how we're capable of reason. In fact, the fact that we're sitting around talking about reason seems to be a pretty good indication that we've got it. But I don't know how often we use it. Most of the day, I think I might just be kind of bumbling around on fear and desire. Occasionally, somebody stops me and says, like, what are you going to do? What's the right thing to do here? And I have to stop and be like, okay. And even sometimes then, I'm just like, God, the thing I feel like doing, that's the right thing. But to actually stop and say, like, no, let's think about this. That's that extra step that humans seem to be capable of. Yes?
What about with like certain insects? They build hives to protect themselves, or they hunt for food to give to the queen's ants, or they burrow underground and have like a whole colony. Would that fall under reason, or would that still be fun?
So here's the thing about ants, or bees too, which seem to be like incredibly organized. And Aristotle himself, in a couple of places, will even say like Bees are like almost conscious. It almost seems like bees have language. They do like little dances to communicate to one another. And they seem to have like an organizational structure for the colony. One way of looking at this, and I'm not actually sure like where Aristotle comes down, he says like bees are like humans in some interesting respects, but they're not actually for really real like that. And his reasoning is a little wishy-washy, but one way that we might say this is that maybe it's the colony, maybe it's the ant colony or the bee colony that is like, maybe that's the ousia, the real thing, and does the colony think? I don't think that the individual bees or ants are thinking. They might just have like very specific instincts. The same way that I don't think that the mitochondria in my cells or the Golgi apparatus is thinking. It just does what it does. And I think that that might be how ants work. But you bring up an interesting point that I'm sure is like on a lot of people's minds, which is like, but wait a minute, maybe humans aren't the only ones that engage in reason, in which case Aristotle would say like, I'm pretty sure humans are the only ones, but I think that if Aristotle was alive today and saw some of the data that was coming out on things like dolphins and some other cetaceans and like some of the great apes, Coco the gorilla, maybe even African gray parrots or something like that. What was that? Harambe? Yeah. Rest in peace. Then Aristotle might be inclined to say like, open up, like, let's make the club bigger. Why not? Sure, if you're in possession of reason, you're this third class of organism that's above animal. Maybe we want to limit it just to humans, and Aristotle thought it was limited to humans. In fact, up until very, very recently, everybody's limited this to just humans. But more recently, we've kind of been like, yeah, maybe the club gets a little bit bigger. Maybe some other critters sneak in which case we might even say something like, yeah, but they don't do it as well. And then we might respond like, not all humans do it all that well either, right? There's variation in like the second energeia on this. Yes? Again, yeah.
Gorillas know that they're gorillas. Like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, do they know that they have the ability to do this and other animals don't? The fact that we know that, isn't that part of the reason? The fact that that you said that we can even think about these things and talk about it.
So one of the things that might be at work here is, there are all kinds of problems, including that, like, who knows what the heck's going on in a gorilla mind? For that matter, who knows what's going on in, like, your mind besides you, right? So, like, these are kind of difficult sorts of things to try to parse. But we might also recognize that, how is it that you said it, that a gorilla doesn't know it's a gorilla?
Yeah, do gorillas realize that?
I think Coco knows that she's a gorilla, right?
She can do sign language, and like she like does like me gorilla, and like she signs, and like it's kind of cool. She communicates with you.
Yeah. Now, here's one thing that we might note, that like that gorilla might not have done it in the wild.
Yeah.
It's only because we taught it. But then again, a human wouldn't do it in the wild either. If you left a human infant with gorillas, I bet they wouldn't learn language. And they might not ever realize that, like, I'm a human. They might not even realize, like, I'm a gorilla. They just go out and, like, eat bananas, whatever it is that gorillas do. So, yeah, like, it has to be taught, but that only tells us that it's a potentiality that needs to be educated and developed, right? And that's true of humans as well. So there might be untapped rational soul in a lot of other animals that, like, it requires education. Yes?
On the same subject, there was a semi or not so very much scientific study done on ravens to tell whether or not they could recognize faces.
Yeah.
And so they kept track of which all the ravens, and they exposed them to different masks and like spooked the ravens.
Yep.
And it turned out that other ravens would recognize the masks that they had never been exposed to.
Word got around. Yeah.
They communicated which faces.
Now, it might have been that they said, like, that's the scary guy, and all the other ravens were like, oh, ah, like that. It might have also been that, like, the ravens that had been exposed to the masks went, ah, and then all the other ones were like, what are we doing now? Like, oh, ah, and they just started doing it even though they didn't know why. Similar sorts of experiments on, I think it's chimpanzees or like some sort of ape or monkey. There are some simians where like you can pass cultural knowledge down like this. I think the experiment is you put a bunch of bananas on top of a ladder in a room and you let the monkeys in, and if they go after the bananas, you like turn the sprinklers on and everybody gets rained on. And the monkeys very quickly learned, like, don't go for the bananas. And then you start like putting new monkeys into this community, and those monkeys will like go after the bananas before they can even get at them. The other monkeys kick the shit out of them. And you're just like, no! And if you kind of like slowly cycle the monkeys out, you can get a community of monkeys that like knows not to touch the bananas, but nobody has any idea why, except that it's just not done. Is that reason? I don't know. I don't know just yet. And this is actually in part because we're almost out of time, and also because we have like a natural sort of transition here. We should talk about not just the human soul and what it is. We should talk about the difference between a soul that's doing well and a soul that's doing poorly, which gets us into this transition into the Nicomachean ethics. The Nicomachean ethics is all about not just what a soul is, but it's all about how to make a soul into a good soul. One of the causes that, and all that stuff that I just erased, if you look back in your notes, you can kind of ferret out all of the causes, like all 4 of the causes, but there's one that's only been kind of weakly represented, and that's the final cause. What is the final cause for a human? What's the purpose of a human? That's a really tough question, but one way of getting at it, as Aristotle points out for us, is you look at any human activity and just ask, like, why? Why did that person do it? Why are you packing your stuff up? Because you need to go to another class? Why do you want to go to the other class? So you can get a seat and you don't want to sit on the floor. Why don't you want to sit on the floor? Why would you prefer to sit in a seat? Because it would make you, yeah, it's always happy. That's the end of this why chain, Aristotle says. Every time you do it, it always comes back to because humans want to be happy. The word is not happy because that's English, and Aristotle didn't speak English. The word is eudaimonia. Eudaimonia, literally good-spiritedness. And eudaimonia, one of the reasons, it's sometimes translated as happiness, but honestly, I think this is a terrible, terrible translation, because we tend to think of happiness as a feeling. I feel happy, right? I feel hungry. If I feel hungry, could I be wrong about whether or not I'm actually hungry? Or if I feel hungry, then I am hungry. I could be wrong?
But there's a type of hunger that you cannot be mistaken about.
That's interesting. If I feel cold, am I actually cold? Like feeling cold is all there is to being cold? Now, like my skin temperature might, but that's like a difference between like whether or not my body is cold and whether or not like, yeah. What about happiness? If I'm like, I feel like I'm happy, could it be possible that I'm not actually happy?
If you're sending it like that, you're probably not happy.
If I say I feel happy, yeah, it's almost like, well, maybe I'm not actually happy. Especially if we think of happiness as, maybe the better word here is flourishing, because Aristotle is quite clear that eudaimonia is an activity, not a feeling. It's the activity, it's the goal. It's the activity of the human soul when it's like just getting everything right. The ideal form, the goal, the telos, the good of any kind of human soul is eudaimonia. It's this activity of flourishing in whatever respect is proper to a human, which we'll know over here just from looking at this. It at least needs to be compatible with reason. 5 more minutes. 5 more minutes, I totally would have had this. So we'll open back up with the end of Book 1 of Nick Ethics, and probably actually most of Book 1 of Nick Ethics at our next meeting. You'll also have new reading. It's going to be Book 2 of Nick Ethics. We'll start getting into talking about moral virtue.